The sun was beginning to set as Faye grabbed her belongings and left the stables. It had been a long day of work for the 16-year-old, and she was keen to get back to her family and climb into bed for the night. The stables were far out into the countryside, so she began to walk down the nearby road to get back to the bus stop. She was alone, surrounded on all sides by the tall trees marking the perimeters of the woodland, and thick bushes dotted along the winding, darkened roads. It might have been spring, but there was a chill in the air. That was when she began to notice it. There was a faint buzz, a consistent hum, almost like electricity in the air. Then the air around her seemed to shimmer slightly. She wasn't far from the bus stop now, but still there was no one around. She glanced about, a little uneasy about what was happening, when suddenly she heard a rustling. Then, from the tree line, she saw a tall figure stepping out of the twilight-lit woods. It was him. She hadn't seen him for nearly 9 years, but he was there. The same tattered clothes, the same strange hopping walk, the white painted face. He was standing there looking at her. She couldn't believe her eyes. Sam, the Sandown Clown, was back. Good evening. Tonight's show will be a little different, because unexpectedly, we're going to be talking about an update to one of the most beloved cases I featured here on the tape library. I hope you're ready for a weird one, because tonight we're getting very weird. The case of the Sandown Clown has fascinated people ever since it made a brief appearance in the UFO journal back in the 1970s. A truly strange encounter that I think stuck with people because it left so many unanswered questions. The people who reported the encounter kept themselves anonymous, just leaving a strange tale that no one could quite understand. Frustratingly, for years, those of us into the strange and the unexplained were left with just a handful of pages detailing this encounter and nothing else. Well, it seems this has changed. A man has been presenting a series of talks on the Isle of Wight, and he claims he has new information. Paul A.T. Wilson is a writer and folklorist who has been documenting the island's folk stories for a number of years now, and he claims that the anonymous girl who saw Sam has finally made herself known. And it seems there is more to her story than we knew. It appears that Sam has visited her multiple times since. I will talk about how this all came about and a little more about Paul later in the episode. But of course, we always start with the story here. So get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It's time to go back to Sandown. This is the return of All Colours Sam. Welcome to the tape library. It's very difficult to tell this story without going back to the beginning. This will be a slightly condensed version of the original encounter. I've done a full episode on Sam if you do want to hear my retelling of that in full, but I will be discussing all the main details here, just in a slightly quicker take. For this, I'll be using the original before article, but also filling in a few details that Paul has brought to light since. If you are already well familiar with the original encounters and just want to get to the new stuff, then chapter times are available. It was May 1973, when a 7-year-old girl who we know as Faye was playing with a friend of hers in an area close to Lake Common on the Isle of Wight. The two children heard a strange noise. They described it almost like the wailing of an ambulance siren. Curious, they decided to go and investigate. The sound drew them across the golf course and through a hedge that led to a marshy meadow that ran alongside the rarely used at the time Sandown Airport. Curiously, as they entered the field, the sound stopped, but still the children ventured on. There was a small wooden footbridge that crossed over a brook, so the two children walked across it. As they did, they got their first glimpse of something strange. A blue-gloved hand suddenly appeared as they walked across, gripping the edge of the bridge from underneath. Then, out crawled a tall figure. It had its back to the two children, so they didn't get a good look at him at first, but they noticed straight away that he had a notebook in his hands. The creature moved awkwardly as it stepped out into the brook, and as it did, it fumbled the book, dropping it into the water. It splashed about trying to retrieve the notebook, before walking away back onto the banks that surrounded the brook. Still, it did not look back at the children. Instead, it walked off further, in a kind of strange hopping motion. That was when they realised it was headed towards a metallic hut that they somehow hadn't noticed before. The being entered the hut that seemed to have no windows. Something about this scared the children enough that they decided they wanted to leave. They had walked about 50 yards away when they heard a sound. The wailing noise had returned. They turned around to see the being was now standing outside the hut, looking at them. In its hand now was what looked like a black knobbed microphone. The wailing noise was so loud this time it caused the boy to run away, but Faye was less intimidated by the being. The boy, though, was stopped in his tracks when the wailing siren stopped, and instead they heard a voice. It looked like the being was talking into the microphone, but they could hear as if he were right next to them. In fact, later Faye would apparently explain it wasn't like they could hear him exactly. It was like its voice was inside their heads. The voice said, "Hello, are you still there?" The voice was friendly, and the two children felt compelled to now approach the being. I will quote the article here for his description. He was nearly 7 feet tall and had no neck, for his head appeared to be wedged straight onto his shoulders. He wore a yellow pointed hat which interlocked with a red collar of a green tunic. A round black knob was affixed to the top of his hat, and wooden antennae were attached either side. The face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square of a nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings were on his paper white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. Wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trousers. The being still had the notebook, and rather than speak again, he initially began communicating through writing. In the notebook he scribbled a series of words. They were presented in a random order and on different parts of the page, but the being then pointed to each word in the order that it wanted to communicate them, and Faye read it aloud. He said, "Hello, and I am all colours, Sam," notably putting a comma between the words colours and Sam, which has led to years of debate of if he was calling himself Sam or for some reason believed that one of the children was called Sam. Either way, the name Sam has stuck for the being. After this he did begin to speak again, but this time without the microphone. To quote the article again, his lips did not move and speech was unclear, rather like that of a person who does not open his mouth properly. He asked the children about themselves, so they ventured to ask questions too. They asked about his clothes, which were all ripped, and he told them he only had one set, so he could only wear those. Because of his strange white features, they asked if he was really a man. The answer was a chuckled no. They also asked if he was a ghost. The vague reply was, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." "What are you then?" they continued, but only obtained the answer, "You know," with no further explanation. Stranger still, during this entire interaction, Faye claimed that there were two workmen fixing a fence post. They were a little way away but should have been able to see the children talking to this strange 7-foot being, but they didn't react at all, almost as though neither the children or Sam were actually there. Sam continued to talk with the children, claiming he had no name, which adds weight to him calling the children Sam rather than himself. He told them there were others like him. He also said he was scared of people and was worried they would hurt him. The being seemed peaceful and fearful rather than anything malevolent. But it then invited the children into his hut. The children were forced to crawl through a flap to get inside. Strangely, Sam was behind them when they crawled through, but was already inside once they'd made it to the other side of the hatch. Sam informed them that this hut was new, he had just made it. The article continues to describe Sam's hut, stating it was across 2 levels. The lower part had plenty of headroom and was wallpapered in blue-green, and covered with a pattern of dials. It also had an electric heater and simple wooden furniture. The upper level was less spacious, and the floor was metallic. He told the children that he fed upon berries, which he collected in the late afternoon. He didn't say where, but did indicate that he had a camp on the mainland that he could go to. He also said that the water from the river could be drunk once it had been cleaned. Once inside the hut, he removed his hat to reveal round white ears and sparse brown hair on his head. Then he showed the children a trick. He placed the berry in his ear, thrust his head forward, and caused the berry to disappear and reappear at one of his odd eyes. Repeating the process, the berry then travelled to his mouth. After around half an hour, the 2 children decided they should leave. They said goodbye to Sam and rushed out of the hut, leaving it behind. They bumped into the groundskeeper after running back to the golf course and told him they had met a ghost, but he just laughed at them. The 2 children kept their experience a secret until 3 weeks later, when Faye finally told her father. At first he was skeptical, but his daughter gave so many details and seemed quite upset when he didn't believe her. He then went and spoke to the boy, who was a lot more reserved but confirmed a number of the details that Faye had reported. Her father went to the location, but could find no sign of Sam or his hut. Her father jumped to the idea that Faye had met an alien, and in his words, was somehow taken into a bubble of alien reality created by this strange personage. The reason for this belief was that the father, who is named Mr. Y in the article, had been encountering numerous UFO sightings over the years prior to Faye's encounter. In fact, he had had one just a few weeks before. More often than not, these were sightings of strange lights in the sky that seemed to follow him, a fact that was backed up by friends of his who had witnessed it too. But one strange encounter he revealed involved him seeing what looked like 2 large yellow lights, like eyes, in the water of Compton Bay, after being forced to climb a cliff due to a sudden tidal surge that had nearly swept him away. It wasn't that he was just seeing something unexplainable. He genuinely believed whatever this was tracking him, and now it had shown an interest in his daughter. Mr. Y contacted UFO researchers and the Ministry of Defence's UFO desk. His story initially appeared in a reduced form in a US UFO magazine, before the now famous write-up in the Bufora Journal that apparently still doesn't quite tell the whole of Mr. Y's UFO encounters, but gives a decent overview of their experiences. Seemingly, Mr. Y just wanted the story out there. He never went public with his identity, never tried to make any money from it, and for years that was all we had. But it seemed for Mr. Y and his family, this wasn't quite the end of the story. Mr. Y continued to encounter strange things, right up to his death in 2005, apparently keeping detailed records in his diary each time it happened. And as for Faye, sometime around 2019, writer Paul A.T. Wilson was contacted by someone, claiming that their mother was the Faye from the Sandown Clown story, and that she wanted to speak with him. Paul was initially skeptical. He had been fascinated by the story for years and had attempted to track down the family numerous times. Along his journey, several supposed fays had come forward, but none had convinced him they were the real deal. However, he still agreed to meet with the woman. When he arrived at her home, the woman handed him a large box. Inside was around 60 pages of documents, handwritten letters to Befora, the original sketches of Sam, even the notebook that Sam had apparently written and drawn pictures in. He couldn't believe it. Was this really Faye? And why come forward with this now? Well, it seems Faye's story with Sam didn't end on that May afternoon, and she had a story to tell Paul. The return of Sam came in 1982, 9 years after the initial sighting. Faye was now a teenager, and as I stated at the start of the episode, she was walking towards a bus stop down a quiet country lane when she heard something. Then, out from the bushes, stepped Sam, moving in the same strange hopping motion. The air around her felt different. There was a faint buzzing that could be heard, and everything seemed to be shimmering slightly. He looked just as she remembered him from all those years ago. He had the same clothes, although they seemed cleaner and less tattered than before. This time he didn't come with a microphone and a book, but with something that kind of resembled a flute with buttons on it. Faye said she wasn't frightened when she saw him, a reaction you may remember she also had on their first encounter. Sam seemed to scare the boy, initially at least, but something about him always made Faye feel comfortable, no matter how otherworldly he may appear. It seemed though that this flute he had wasn't an instrument. Sam could use it to draw. He waved it around, and it created what she described as almost like moving chalk drawings in the air. Why he was doing this seems unclear, although that is a recurring theme in most of the interactions with Sam. They are all tinged with these strange behaviours and odd communications. Sam began to speak. Faye noted that this time his voice was clearer, that it felt less robotic in her mind, although that didn't mean it was straightforward. Sam said he had been keeping an eye on her, that he was glad that they had become friends. Sam led most of the interaction because Faye just didn't seem to know what to say or how to react. It seems as though she never expected to see Sam again, and now he was there, standing in front of her. She didn't know what to do. Sam continued, informing her that things were better now, that he didn't have to forage for food or hide. Faye asked him what he meant by things being better, but Sam, in classic Sam fashion, didn't elaborate. After standing there with Sam for around 10 minutes, Faye told him she needed to go home, that her family would be worried. Sam nodded his head, before saying, "I will see you again 4 more times if you want. Travel safely." Then he turned and hopped away into the tree line, leaving Faye stood there in a stunned silence. She didn't have to wait long for Sam's next appearance. 1 year later, Faye was now 17 years old, and it was a warm summer evening in 1983. Faye had gone to meet up with some friends down the park, sat on a couple of concrete benches. The group were smoking cigarettes and drinking, typical teenager stuff. A half-empty bottle of sherry taken from one of their parents was being passed around. Faye hadn't even had a chance to have a drink when it happened. This time though, it started with a smell. Soil. The overwhelming smell of earth suddenly filled her nostrils, and that was followed by what she described as burnt leaves. Then, everything changed. She was still in the park, still on the concrete bench, but her friends were all gone. The way she described it was that the world had been overlaid with something unseen. The colours of the bushes and grass around her seemed deeper. The shadows from the trees seemed longer and exaggerated. And it was silent. Eerily silent. She said it was like reality had been turned down, not off. She wasn't somewhere completely beyond the veil. It was like her world had been simply tuned out a little. Then she saw him. That pale white face with its painted features. The tall, slim frame of Sam stood just a few feet away from her in the middle of the path. But this time, he was not alone. Sam had alluded to there being others like him, but now Faye was meeting some of them. Behind Sam stood others. She struggled to make out details of them. She could tell they looked a similar size to Sam, wore similar patchwork-style clothing, but they were hard to look at. Like her eyes couldn't seem to quite focus on them. Some, she said, almost looked like they shimmered, like the air had done on Sam's return, that kind of haze that you see on the horizon on a hot day. She could also hear them, kind of. She described it not as speech, but chattering to one another. It wasn't like any sound she had heard before, and it felt distorted, like hearing voices through a thick pane of water. In her words, she called it language without meaning. She then noticed something else along the path. Tall, freestanding shapes that appeared to be doorways to other places. Tall enough for the lanky frame of Sam and his buddies to enter. Sam approached her, in a smooth, calm motion, almost as though he were trying not to scare her. Sam simply said, "I'm glad you are here. You are doing well." Again, Faye felt overwhelmed and speechless, but Sam didn't seem bothered by her silence, and instead guided her along the path. As they passed each of the objects, she glanced in at them. Even before looking, she noted that each doorway had its own unique feel, an atmosphere radiating off of them. Through one, she saw something green and bright. Another had what looked like stars in a blackened sky. One shimmered much like the entity seemed to do on occasion. She said each doorway showed her something different. She struggles to remember them all. Mostly she spoke of the feeling each one gave her. Some felt joyous, others cold. But one stuck in her memory. A view of the world from high above. She said she could see Europe, but in her words it had no borders, no barbed wire. As she looked at it, Sam spoke. He said that the world would not end in her lifetime, that there would be no nuclear war, and that Europe would not be split for long. Given the situation at the time, the constant threat of nuclear war, and the clear divide through the continent, it seemed Sam was addressing some of the young girl's deepest concerns for the world, like he knew what she was worrying about, deep down. Then Sam explained, this is the second visit. If she still wants him to come, he will visit her 4 times. She asked Sam why. Why her? Why keep coming back? Sam just nodded. Then, she was back. There was no big change, no sounds. She was just back on the bench with her friends, still talking and drinking. Faye asked them how long she had been gone. They all looked confused before they began to laugh. Faye hadn't been anywhere. She had been sat there the whole time. In Faye's mind, she had been gone with Sam for a while, but to them no time had passed at all. The following year brought Sam back for a much shorter, but seemingly very important encounter. It was a cold and drab winter afternoon in Newport. Faye had travelled to the town to meet up with her boyfriend. There were a series of alleyways that run along behind many of the houses in the area, so she decided to take a shortcut down one of them. She started walking, but as she got to a certain point, she felt the odd compulsion to turn and walk a different way. She did. Sure enough, Sam soon appeared, walking out from behind a fence, startling Faye. This time he looked very different. He still stood out with his unnatural tall and stooped posture. but it was like he was more human this time. He was dressed in more normal clothes. He didn't appear to be painted white. He didn't walk in his strange hopping motion. Even his mannerisms and speech patterns seemed to more resemble a normal person. Sam told Faye that he didn't have much time, that he was using up one of his visits to do this. The girl asked him what he meant. Sam said to her, "I know where you are going, to see the boy. You shouldn't. Just turn around, just go home. That is all. Please." Then Sam stepped away and he was gone. The entire appearance was over in moments. Faye took Sam's plea seriously. She turned around and walked back, heading home. The exact details of what happened have been left out to protect the identity of those involved, but it appears that Faye's boyfriend and his friends were arrested later that night for robbing a place. Sam had apparently stepped in to stop Faye from getting mixed up in this trouble. In stark contrast, Sam's next visit would be much longer. He was gone for a number of years. It was 1989. Faye was now very much an adult. Newly married, she was soon to leave the island to move into her new home with her husband on the mainland. While the final arrangements were being sorted, Faye was temporarily living with a friend still on the Isle of Wight, when she decided to go out for a walk on her own. As she was walking through a nearby field, something grabbed her attention. A hut. She said it almost looked like a sleek, futuristic-looking train carriage. Long, white, smooth, but strangely with a roof made of corrugated iron that was slightly bowed, giving the top a strong contrast to the sleekness of the rest of the structure. It stood out because it looked so out of place, like it had just been dropped there. Then she saw him, standing outside the hut, just like he had all those years before when she first met him. He looked more like he had done on their previous encounters. The same painted face, the same odd clothing. He invited her in for tea. Inside there was a table, 2 chairs and a strange device that kind of looked like a kettle, but wasn't. It was light inside, but she couldn't tell where the source of light was coming from. Sam and Faye sat down, and he proceeded to pour her a cup of tea into a cup that looked like porcelain, but was soft and pliable when she picked it up. The tea smelt of herbs, but she couldn't say what they were. Still, it tasted sweet and comforting. She said they then spoke for a long time, but much like her other encounters with Sam, her memory of it isn't crystal clear. She just remembers bits and pieces of their conversations. She would describe this phenomenon as a sort of soft forgetting, like waking up from a vivid dream. Some details remained, but others just seemed to fade away quickly after they happened. One thing she did note though, was that Sam said the Berlin Wall would fall, which it did later that year. This wasn't the first time he had alluded to this event happening. It seemed to be an important thing to Sam. Towards the end of their conversation, Sam informed Faye that he would only see her one more time, and that last time would be at the end. Finally, Faye asked him where he was from, and Sam gave a very Sam answer. He said he was from this place, but different. Sam took her back outside the hut. She said goodbye to him and Sam raised his hand to wave. Faye began to walk away. When she looked back, Sam and the hut were gone. She hasn't seen Sam since, but she knows she will. One day. One last time. So I kind of touched on it earlier, but let's talk about where this story has come from. Initially, this update was brought to my attention by one of you leaving me a comment on my Sam episode. To begin with, I was very skeptical. My thought was that we obviously know so little about the identities of Faye and her father that it would be very easy for anyone to claim to be her. But regardless, I wanted to know more. So I found out that Paul Wilson had done an interview with the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, and I listened to that. Prior to that, he had also had a similar conversation on the AP Strange show, and instantly I felt this was more interesting than I had initially thought. As I mentioned before, Paul is a writer and folklorist who lives on the Isle of Wight, and has written a great deal about the history and folklore of the island. He claims that he has been interested in the Sandown Clown case since he was a child, when his father told him the story as they walked past the golf course. Over the years, he has attempted to try and learn the identity of Faye, but with no luck. He says he's been contacted by a few people over the years that claim to be her, but they offered little to no additional information than what was present in the Before article, and some seemed more interested in getting money or attention from this case, which seemed at odds with the prior confidentiality that the family were insistent on. This was until around 2019, when someone got in touch claiming to be the child of Faye, and that she wanted to speak to Paul. Paul met the woman at her home, and she showed him a box of around 60 pages of documents. Among them were the original sketches of Sam, a long-lost magazine article that predates the Before article, what looks like handwritten back and forth correspondence between Mr. Y and Before, letters to the MOD UFO desk, and most interestingly of all, what is presented as the original notebook Sam apparently had, still water damaged and containing the famous line, "Hello, and I am all colours, Sam." The notebook hasn't been written in since Sam jotted that down. In his interviews, Paul reveals that seemingly Sam also drew a number of doodles in the book, drawings of trees and rocks in a very simple style, but also strange symbols that he likened to spirograph but hand-drawn. This supposed Faye then went on to tell Paul about all her other encounters. Paul says there is a reason she has come forward now after all this time, but he wasn't able to explain why. There's quite a few details that Paul is unwilling to give up in his interviews, which is simultaneously frustrating but also understandable. It seems that if this is the real Faye, she is still very concerned about her identity being kept secret, both for herself and her family. So any details that could give away that information is being kept away from the public eye. He was able to see the documents, but Faye obviously did not want him to take the originals. So instead he has scanned a lot of them and made transcripts of his interviews, but as it stands these are not available online yet. So far, Paul has held 2 talks on the Isle of Wight, sharing more details about Faye and Mr. Y's experiences, with a third scheduled for later in the year. At the time of writing this, the second talk is scheduled for a couple of days' time, and will apparently be recorded and put up on YouTube, so if this is out already, I'll provide a link for you all to see it. So, is all of this real? Is this really Faye? Can Paul A.T. Wilson be trusted? Or is this simply a case of people trying to involve themselves in a now beloved piece of strange history? Well, Paul himself says this could be a hoax, but you have to question why. He said that if the documents are fake, then someone has gone through a lot of effort to make them seem convincing. And to what gain? Paul himself is a folklorist. Much like me, his primary interest is the story, not the actual proof of if Sam is real or not. So if the story is true or not, it doesn't really affect him in any way. This Faye is not making any money from this, nor is she getting any wider attention. Paul has put on talks, so obviously is benefiting from this in some way, but he also plans to put these talks up for everyone to view on YouTube, and has said that if he were to write a book on the subject, that he would make sure a copy were available to download for free. The primary goal of both of these people seems to be to get the story out there, rather than any sort of personal gain. If all we had were the claims by Faye, then this would be much easier to dismiss, but the work that has apparently gone into the documents adds an air of believability that this could be the real person. Although, even if she is the real Faye, I'm not sure anything here gets us closer to understanding the mystery of Sam. If anything, it opens up so many new riddles. Let's go with the more skeptical side first. While the documents potentially prove that Faye and her father were real people who claim to have experienced something extraordinary, they do not in any way prove that the encounters really happened. The documents have also, so far, only been shown at Paul's talks, and the wider public hasn't had a chance to really pore over exactly what he has. When this does happen, it may allow us to really get an idea of if these could be genuine or not. There is also a comment on both podcasts I mentioned that seems to cast some doubt on Paul's reliability in this case. Although it's worth noting, it doesn't feel like a big smoking gun that discredits this case or anything, simply making a point that it feels fairly unbelievable and questioning a few details, but I thought it was still worth mentioning. Paul states that the handwriting in the notebook doesn't match Mr. Y's handwriting, but that doesn't mean someone else couldn't have written it. Mr. Y apparently wrote for years about being followed by the lights in the sky. Paul also makes mention these encounters over time turned darker and more sinister. This is an evolving story, and he hasn't got into the Mr. Y encounters fully yet. Apparently he plans to present these later in the year, but the skeptical view of this could point to Mr. Y being a very paranoid and potentially delusional individual. I don't buy into the idea that his claims were a deliberate hoax as such, but that doesn't mean they are true either. Maybe this man truly did believe that something otherworldly was out to get him. Maybe his daughter picked up on elements of this over the course of her childhood, and that combined with her childish imagination conjured up the story of Sam. Again, maybe she wasn't lying as such, but did have an encounter with a strange man that she has turned into something more fantastical. I think that could explain the initial encounter, but the subsequent ones make that idea a little more difficult. But of course, we don't know Faye. We have no idea what she's like as a person, her reliability as a narrator, her mental capacity. Faye would never report any of her subsequent encounters to anyone, but she did discuss it with her father. Seemingly, they both decided to keep what was happening to them throughout their lives to themselves after the Bufora article. Maybe they didn't think it was taken seriously enough and decided it wasn't worth trying to convince others. But as has always been the case with Sam, the more interesting part of this story is the fantastical side. This is a story that has always had virtually no evidence behind it, just the claims of two children and a father. So why would anyone take it seriously? Well, I think in part we all enjoy it just because of how weird it is, and in an odd way, that strangeness makes it feel a little bit more real. It's all the little details about his speech, his appearance, the strange elements like the decorations in his hut, the trick with the berries, the pliable cups, his apparent ability to temporarily seem more like a normal person when needed. It just doesn't really fit into any of the common tropes you see so often in supposed paranormal encounters. Even the characters in this story don't create a cohesive narrative between them. Mr. Y seems very focused on the UFO aspects. He sees UFOs. He thinks UFOs are following him, and continues to believe this throughout his entire life. He even reports his daughter's encounter to a UFO publication, and refers to Sam as an alien. But Faye does none of this. There is no UFO in her original encounter, nor the later ones. Certainly there are elements that echo stories of abductions, but she never seems to go down this route too heavily. Faye at the time did, and according to Paul still does, refer to Sam as a ghost. She also sees him as a kind of guardian angel-like character in her life. The boy in her original story is scared. Her father is scared. But Faye just seems to accept Sam as a part of her life. Then there are Sam's claims of him being from this place but different. In Faye's accounts of her encounters with Sam, it makes him feel more like a traveller from another dimension. Many have compared him to stories of encounters with fairies that have been baked into the historical folklore of our country forever. I opened my initial video on Sam with a quote from John Keel, and it still feels so relevant here. He famously wrote, "They are not from outer space. There is no need for them to be. They have always been here." Paul revealed in his conversations across the two podcasts that since coming out with this story, more people have contacted him. Not with stories of Sam as such, but claims of encounters that echo those of Faye's. Could this all just be a hoax? Perhaps. But that has always been the case with the Sandown Clown story. Maybe this isn't another chapter in the story of All Colours Sam. Maybe the story we've known and loved for so many years was nothing more than a prologue. Maybe there is much more to this story than we could have ever possibly imagined. That's all for this entry into the tape library. As a general rule, I tend to not jump onto trending topics on the show. One of the reasons I typically prefer to tackle older cases is that you have the benefit of being able to look back on it from above, rather than being caught up in the narrative that is unfolding. But for this, I had to make an exception. Sam feels like such an important character in the world of this show. It's one of my most popular episodes of all time, and is a story that I am personally obsessed with. So once I realised there was a little more to this claim of additional encounters, I had to get involved. I'll be keeping an eye on what happens next, and maybe we'll have to do a part 3 on Sam in the future. I'm going to include links to both of the podcasts I mentioned here. If you want to hear what Paul has to say for himself, I'd strongly recommend checking those out. They're really good interviews. And as I said, I'll include a link if Paul's presentation is online by the time I publish this. Paul has another talk coming up in November at the Bembridge Fort, in which he apparently plans to delve more into the Mr. Y stuff. I would love to attend myself, but I don't think I'm going to be able to, annoyingly. But if you are able to get to the Isle of Wight in November, I'll include a link to that as well. So, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think this really could be Faye? And what do you make of these new encounters? Let me know in the comments below. We obviously had some fairly big news regarding the tape library recently. Many of you will already be aware, but the show is now part of the Spectavision radio network. I just want to take a moment to talk about that and what it means for the show, if you'll indulge me a little bit longer. For those who don't know, Spectavision is a production company formed by Elijah Wood and producers Daniel Noah and Josh Waller. They are responsible for some great pieces of weird cinema, like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Colour Out of Space, Mandy, and the absolute masterpiece that is The Greasy Strangler. I'm a massive film nerd, so I've been a huge fan of what these guys are doing for a long time. Last year they launched Spectavision Radio, which was their foray into the world of podcasts, and they instantly signed up a really impressive roster of people, from filmmakers like Mike Flanagan and Joe Dante, to names big in the supernatural and esoteric worlds like Greg and Dana Newkirk, Mitch Horowitz and Jim Perry. I've been asked to join podcast networks a few times and really had no interest in doing it, but when Spectavision got in touch it felt very different. This was a company I was already a big fan of, and they were amassing a roster of talent that I thought was really impressive. This was a great group of talented individuals, and I was honoured to be invited to get involved. They wanted it to be an artist-led group and were very open to keeping things weird. More importantly, it was being run by people who were creative individuals themselves, not just a faceless business. But what does this mean for the show? Well, not a lot really as far as you guys are concerned. Spectavision Radio are going to be helping me out with the podcast side of things. This is one of the reasons you can now see my videos on Spotify, and you may hear me promoting shows from time to time on their network, but I would happily do that anyway. They've got stuff like Knife Point Horror. That show was the soundtrack to my long journeys home from my office job years ago, so a lot of their podcasts have a special place in my heart. Beyond that, nothing will be changing. I am the sole person behind the creative side of the tape library, and that remains the case. So don't worry, this is still going to be exactly the same as it always was. I wouldn't have agreed to join if any of the decisions being made on the direction of the tape library were being taken away from me. Long story short, the tape library is now part of the Spectrovision radio network. They are really cool people promoting really cool shows. Nothing regarding the actual content of the tape library is changing, and I'm really excited to be working with these guys. I know shows joining networks sometimes lead to things you like about that show changing, so I just wanted to set any concerns aside here. This is my creepy little baby still. Well, it's getting late and I've kept you here long enough. As always, if you are new here, please do click subscribe. And if you're listening to the podcast version, please do leave the show a rating. Although, if it's anything less than 5 stars, I may send a certain dole after you. What I've got planned for September is something I've promised you guys for a long time, but is something a little controversial. So I'm bracing myself for war in the comment section. Then we'll be into October, which is obviously a really busy time for the show, so there's lots of exciting stuff coming up. If you want to support the show, you can do that through Patreon and YouTube memberships. As a thank you, you get a few additional perks on either platform. So let's thank those awesome people who keep the show ticking along. Our tape library archivist Umiko Grimm, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Tina S, Thomas Boatwright, the Crimson DM, the Detective, Stephen Lutman, Sean Miller, Sandy Lusk, Sag El Kali, Sarah Boyd, Restock 1731, Rosary Sudrabin, Quirky Joseph, Plum Blossom, Pixelina, Monty Montes, Mirashard, Midia Zabine, Emmy Bartley, Lady Bet Noir, Juno, Judith Hacker, Joseph Condola, Jolly Jedi, Joe, Gina Britton, G-Raw, Gabrielle, Emily Carlin, Eric Salas, Dagon O'Dorleg, Dominic DeAngelis, Dawn Swan, Darla, Crystal Edwards, Ashlos Books, Alfredo Sandoval and Adeline. Our lead archivist, Xavier Rangel, Vaniel, Tyler Michael, Tracy Torello, The Original Deer, Ridiculous, Old Soul Like Mine, Plague Doctor is in, Melissa Harrison, Lord William, London Grace, Creepy Candy, Brian Baker, Amy Stubblefield, Alex O'Neill, Alex Goldberg, 1000th Ghost. And our very generous Grand Overseers, the God Emperor of Mankind, Morning Rain 2619, Leah Carmella, Katie, Harrison the Ogre Bad Diddley, Agent 355, and Queen of Flatulence. As always, a huge thank you to them, all my junior archivists on Patreon, and my members on YouTube. All your contributions play a huge part in keeping the tape library and Night Drive Paranormal going. Speaking of which, that show will also be back very soon. That's all for tonight. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.